What I'm about to show you might just change your life. I have an all-free Reaper mixing template that you can use for your own songwriting, recording, and learning about using Reaper. And I'm giving it to you 100% for free, with all free plugins. And that sounds great, but it means nothing if it doesn't sound good. So let's first check out how it sounds. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty good to me. So let's dive in and see what's under the hood. What I wanted for this project was something lightweight and versatile, using minimum third-party plugins so you could easily install and get to using this template. The third-party plugins we need are a drum kit, amplifiers, impulse responses, and a synthesizer. Everything else is being done with stock plugins included with Reaper. I've tested out installing this project completely from scratch on a machine with no copy of Reaper and no plugins, and only took me about 10 minutes to source everything. Included in the project file is a README which has more notes on this project as well as links to where you can find all the plugins. I promise you it is a quick and easy installation, and it is not terribly resource intensive for those who may not have a powerful computer. So whether you are new to audio production in general, Reaper specifically, mixing, or would just like an easy template to use to speed up your songwriting process, I hope that this can be of some utility to you and improve your creative flow. Once all the plugins are installed, you will be able to open the project and be greeted by my lovely demo track. So for this project, I did 3 different guitar amps, a bass amp, keys, and drums. You can certainly add to it, but those are the basic starting points I went with. So for most modern productions, we are recording guitars in stereo, 100% left and 100% right. In this project, I have a parent amp track running in stereo with the child tracks, which have no effects on them, which are just routing to that stereo amp. So here's a look at the routing of the guitar tracks. On the left-hand side, you can see a list of all the effects on this track. This is my high gain amp track. And here is the routing window. You can see it has its 2 child tracks here, which are routed to receive post effects from it, which means the fader does nothing. The volume on the track is here and not on the master fader on the mixer. And they are 100% left and 100% right currently. These parameters, of course, could be changed, but that's how it's set up. All of the effects then are routed in stereo. I have a overdrive pedal, an amp, the cab sim, EQ, and a multi-band compressor on that track. A similar setup for the crunch amp and the clean amp. I much prefer this method of routing my left and right guitars to a single stereo amp because I can make global changes to the amplifier, I can add or subtract effects pedals, I can change the EQ, and I don't have to copy things twice for each track. It's also only half as resource intensive on your CPU, which especially for those who have older computers is important. So to record to a track in Reaper or most DAWs, we need to arm the track for recording, and we need to select the input. The input selection here will depend on your interface. You may have 1 or 2, you may have 32. You will need to select whatever input you are plugging into and arm the track for recording, and then you can hit record on the transport or Control R in Reaper. You can arm multiple tracks if you are recording in stereo or multiple instruments such as a drum kit. So the basic workflow in this template would be to set your tempo, and I prefer to use markers rather than the global project tempo, because that way we can have, for example, multiple songs with different tempos in the same project. Once you have your tempo selected, you can write however you want, but you'll record the left and right guitars into whatever amp you want. I have a high gain, a crunch, and a clean amp set up already here, as well as a bass amp. If you're recording any keyboards, I have a basic synth track set up, and that will be typically recorded over USB or MIDI on a MIDI keyboard, and then you can route in whatever instruments you want, whatever synthesizers you want. You can either write drums via mouse or MIDI keyboard, or you can just use other people's MIDI data and import that into your project as well. In the MT Power Drum Kit, we have a lot of different groove options in these folders that you can play, and you can drag and drop them into this composer and then put those into your project, like so. This composer then can be dragged and dropped right into your project. And there we have these 8 bars that I just wrote in here. Even if you're using the built-in grooves, you can go into the MIDI editor and change the cymbals. You can add or remove snare and kick hits, tom hits. So don't be afraid to use them as a starting point and customize them for your song. The nice thing about these built-in grooves is the attention to detail in terms of velocity, and that really makes the drum beat sound a lot more organic and real. Let's listen to how it sounds with the multiple velocity layers, and then I will go back and remove that. So if I take all the hits here and make them the same level, drop them back down to a modest volume, let's listen to how much more lifeless it sounds without any variation in velocity. Still a good sounding drum kit, but it loses a lot of its character when you remove the velocity. So when you're writing your own drum parts, pay attention to stressed and unstressed beats, to ghost notes, and you can hit H on the keyboard, which brings up the Humanize tab, and add some random velocity and timing defects, which A little bit goes a long way in terms of humanizing things. Too much can sound strange because, as you see, it's not going to stress the beats in a way a real drummer would. It's just going to randomly make some things louder or softer. Same thing with the timing. It's not really going to make it groove harder. It's just going to make it a little bit looser, which can be good for adding some realism, but I would be careful with that. You can also, if you are programming MIDI on a keyboard and your timing isn't perfect, hit Q to bring up the quantize menu. You have to set your grid to the shortest note value that this part contains. If we go to eighth notes, you can see it starts to shift things around. If we go to half notes, it's going to completely ruin the drum beat. So 16th notes in this case is the smallest note value we have. If you go to 30 seconds, it doesn't do anything. At 16th notes, it is correct. That's fine. You have options for what it is quantizing, as well as in the top menu in Reaper, you can set either these rectangles, which are good if you're writing melodic parts, or you can set it to triangles or diamonds for writing drum parts. If you're having trouble with lag or delay when you're recording, go to the device tab under your properties and check the ASIO settings and change your latency to low or lowest. The faster your computer is and the lighter your project is, the lower latency you can get away with without artifacts. This project on my PC is perfectly fine at lowest latency and would be probably on a lot of computers, but in a less powerful machine, you might start having weird glitches appear. You can disable effects that you're not using temporarily, or you can go into some effects like the Ignite effects and change the oversampling rate. I have it set to 8 times, which is the highest, which should be fine on most systems, but you can set it down to 2 times, and that will that might cut your CPU usage in half. So if you're having trouble with this project in terms of CPU usage, then just change the oversampling rates on all the Ignite plugins. Let's go over a few basic editing and recording tips. One of the first things I would do is go into your preferences and look at the media item defaults tab and uncheck crossfade when splitting items. That way, when you're recording guitars, if you're punching in a lot, you're not creating all these crossfades that you're going to have to later remove. We're going to manually crossfade items. So uncheck that completely, because those can be a real pain, and they can be a pain for other engineers who then have DIs with little tiny gaps in them, which can cause little tiny dropouts and pops or clicks in the sound. So when you're recording, it's fine to do multiple punch-ins and takes. At the end, when you've finished all your takes for the song, I would go back and let's just, for example, split up this track a little bit. And let's say we punched in there, and these are all separate takes. Now in this case, I've already done this, but one thing I would do is if you scroll up on the mouse, you will zoom in, and I will also enlarge this track here. And we can hold shift and move this split point around. And you might want to select at a point where you're not clipping part of the transient, or you're not getting 2 overlapping notes in your guitar tracks. And then you can do this one by one and hold shift and create a little crossfade that way. What I like to do, once you've got your split points accurate, like see here, I would be cutting a note, and if these were different takes, that might sound funny. So let's move this point over here between notes, and then I can select all of these takes, and since they're all selected, I can make a little crossfade here. Doesn't need to be very long. And now we've crossfaded all of our segments. And then go back and listen to that solo to make sure that your crossfades aren't causing any pops or weird artifacts going on. And then you have a cleanly edited guitar take. Likewise, I would go ahead and add a small crossfade to all your tracks at the in and out points so that you don't get any potential popping there. Not all effects will cause it, but some will, and it may drive you nuts until you find the takes that don't have crossfades somewhere, or that there's a little edit point. And when you have a lot of takes going on and you haven't been careful about editing all that stuff, it can really be difficult to find out later where exactly it is and what that noise you're hearing is. So I would go ahead and, as you're recording one side of the guitar or both sides of the guitar, go back and edit those tracks as they're done. And then once you have, if you have multiple files like this and they're edited together and you've double checked that the edits are clean, then you can right click and hit glue items, and there you've bounced a new clean track and you don't have all those splits anymore. And if you do move it, you're moving the whole thing. Also be careful not to move your tracks because you'll get out of alignment. For this project, I only have one bass amp here. I often do the same thing I do with the guitars here, where I have child tracks on that for the bass. If I'm parallel processing, say, a distortion or a fuzz signal with a clean amp signal, and that's very easy to set up the same way as the guitars. The only difference is I wouldn't pan them, of course. Leave everything centered for the bass, and then you can use the routing or any of the effects to blend how much of the distortion and the clean amp you want in that signal. Taking a look at the mixer here, I don't have a crazy amount of effects going on. I wanted to keep this relatively clean and basic. The main routing here is the drums, which are being split out from the MIDI host track to a drum bus, which I created, and then all of the individual drum channels that is created by the plugin when you go to the multi-channel routing, which if you were setting this up yourself, you go to options. I have the drum plugin selected here, and you can build multi-channel routing for output of selected effects. That will create these channels you see, which have the individual drums routed to them. And depending on the plugin, you may need to go back and make sure that the correct signal path is going where you want it to be, or look under the mixer here and make sure that these outputs are where you want them to be. I did have to do this custom on this plugin to make sure that my kick was going to a kick channel and I had a snare channel and so on and so forth. So this I did build myself, but it's pretty easy to do. I do have a fake drum room here. This particular plugin does not have a room recording in it. Some do. You can use that like Superior Drummer does. Either way, whether it has a room recording or not, I like to send that to a reverb channel, which in this case I do have reverb I made for it, as well as that's being compressed too. And you want those room sounds, whether you're sampling drums or recording acoustic drums. The room sells the drum kit and makes it sound real and natural and not just a collection of close mics. So that's very important, and getting a good room sound and balancing that with the rest of the elements of the kit is very important to creating a good and lifelike drum set. Reaper doesn't have a great built-in reverb. There's two options, reverberate and reverb, and I'm using the reverb generator, and I tweaked the settings until I had it where I was happy with it, and I think it sounds pretty good. It's not my favorite reverb. It's not one I would probably ever use, but part of this challenge was to do things with stock plugins, and I didn't want to make you download a third-party reverb. There's plenty out there. I would recommend getting some either free or paid versions. Reverb is pretty important, and the built-in Reaper reverbs are pretty limited, but they are functional, and you don't need a ton of reverb on everything, so maybe it's good that there isn't too much. My guitar setups are pretty basic. I have a Tube Screamer style plugin, which tightens up the guitars going into the amp, gives you a tighter low end and mids that will cut through better. I have the great Emissary amp, which is probably the best free amp sim. Certainly one of them. I like it quite a lot. I like the sound of it, and it comes with NAD-IR, which is my favorite impulse response loader, and that comes with some good impulses too. NAD-IR doesn't use a lot of resources, it has no latency, and it has some good tone shaping options here, which are basic but saves you from some EQing down the line. It's got low pass and high pass for both your impulses, as well as cab resonance which it generates based on the impulse response, as well as a room resonance you can add for some extra sort of reverb on there. And of course, you've got faders for balancing your channels. The stock impulses that it comes with are Vintage 30, based on the Vintage 30 speaker, which is a classic, with SM57, 441, and 421 mics. Nothing groundbreaking and new, but that's what most people are using and what most people want. So they sound good. It covers all your bases there. The crunch channel is the same setup with lower gain, a little different EQ, and the addition of delay on here, because I also use this as a lead solo channel. My clean channel is the same amp on the clean channel with a compressor, a chorus pedal, and a delay after the amp. The bass uses the SHB1 from Ignite, which is a nice bass amp. We are using the NAD IR again, but this time with the bass impulses that I put a link to. And this is quite a nice free pack with a lot of different speakers here and a number of different mics. Bass also has a compressor and an automated chorus, which turns on for the bass solo at the end. The synthesizer I chose for this is the Uno 62 from TAL, which is based on the Roland Juno 60, which is a classic analog synthesizer. It's a pretty basic and easy to use interface, but it's powerful for a lot of your vintage synth needs. Synthesizers are the kind of thing that you can buy a million plugins, you can download a bunch of free synthesizers, and it really depends on what you're trying to do for the project, if you need one at all. But this is a good starting point for learning about synths, and it's quite versatile for a lot of different uses. And it sounds good. It's a classic sounding instrument. I like it. I use it a lot. That's running through a compressor, and then a special trick for you. I am using ReaEQ and getting a sort of Auto-Wah effect. That's Auto-Wah, not Auto-Wah from Canada. So the EQ has this narrow band filter, and that is being automated. If you go to your effects parameter list, parameter modulation, I have this LFO. So an LFO is a low frequency oscillator. This is controlling it. It's synced up with the tempo of the project, and you can set the maximum up and down points. So you can see I've got a little low and high pass filter on this, and I want to keep this wah effect within there. And it's just a cool little advanced trick. Saves you from having a plugin for that, and it's a cool little thing you can do. My mastering chain is pretty simple here. I have a light general compressor going to just tame a little bit off the top end. There's this JS plugin based off a Fairchild 670, which is a classic 60s compressor. That's also just taking a little bit off the top, and then that's going into a limiter, which is boosting 3 dB. It is sitting right around minus 11 dB LUFS, which is a pretty good range for a modern mix. We're typically working between, -9 on the louder end to -14 on the quieter end. And it's not as important anymore to push things super loud. We don't really necessarily want distortion. Streaming apps like Spotify have built-in volume regulation. Apple Music, Amazon does, YouTube does. So we can't really push things too loud. So if you're introducing a lot of distortion in your compressors, you're probably making it too loud. That being said, compression is something that can also glue stuff together and add a nice flavor. So it's not a bad thing. You just want to use it within reason. We're not abusing compressors to get maximum loudness so much. We are using them to get the right flavor and dynamics. Loudness isn't the whole point of the audio game anymore. So that pretty much covers the basic setup. If you have two monitors, I highly recommend moving your mixer to your second monitor. I always keep mine set up that way. By default, it will be all on one monitor, but you can move your mixer, and if you have access to that, you really should, because it makes it much easier to edit on one screen and mix on another and have a lot more space for stuff. Otherwise, it starts getting crowded with all these plugins. There's a million free plugins out there you can check out. I didn't want to make you download a whole bunch for this project, but there's plenty more you can test out. You can make copies of this project and do whatever you want with it. You can use it as it is and release an album if you are so inclined. I'm putting this out for free, and there's certainly no limitations on it. So if you do use it to make anything cool, please send me a link. But it is 100% free for you to use, and I hope that you learn something from it and that you can improve your workflow. Even if you don't like my mixing decisions or my use of EQ and compressors or my choice of software, amps, and instruments, you can get rid of that. The routing alone, I think, is half of what I want to show people with this, because it took me a long time to sort of learn to organize projects in a way that was not just a confusing mess. And so I'm hoping to make things visually easy to use and laid out the way that makes sense for a general workflow. And I use templates a lot to have a good starting point and save me a lot of time, because otherwise I tend to be using a lot of the same plugins and the same routing between projects, and I know how to set up pretty quickly from scratch. But why make it all from scratch when I can have a template ready to just load up, and if I have an idea, I can just go in and record it, and I have everything set up. It already sounds good, and if I want to take it in a different aesthetic direction, I can. But I think it's really important to have something that is solid and right there for you when you want to record a song and write some music. And you can always play around with the engineering of it later. But often when we have a creative idea and we want to record something, we're not trying to play engineer for hours first before we get to actually recording. So it's nice to have something that will just allow you to write and get those creative juices flowing. So I hope that you enjoy this and learn from it, and that it can be some benefit to you. And if you have any questions and comments, please feel free to reach out to me and leave a comment. As always, please like and subscribe, and if you enjoyed this project, let me know what you used it for, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.